I want to be honest with you. There are things I should have done differently. I should have said no a long time ago, not out of cruelty, but out of love. Real love. The kind that actually prepares a child for the world instead of just handing it to them wrapped in a bow. But I didn't. And because I didn't, my son stood in my own living room, the room where I taught him to read, where we watched football on Sunday afternoons, where his mother spent her last good years before the cancer took her and told me I had 30 days to get out. And then, 4 months later, he had the nerve to send me a bill for $245,000. He attached a note. It said, and I want you to hear this exactly as I heard it. Consider it your contribution to the family you always claim to love so much. I sat at my kitchen table, my temporary kitchen table, in the apartment I had rented after my own son changed the locks, and I read that note 3 times. Then I set it down, poured myself a cup of coffee, and I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt more than I can describe to you. It hurt the way only betrayal from someone you raised with your own hands can hurt. I smiled because I finally understood what I had to do, and I knew exactly how to do it. My name is Harold. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, working on bridges and highway infrastructure across the Midwest. I was not flashy. I was not the kind of man who drove expensive cars or wore expensive watches. I drove a Ford pickup for 12 years, and I was proud of it. What I did do was save and invest carefully and build a life for my family that was solid, the way a well-designed bridge is solid engineered to last, not just to impress. My wife, Patricia, and I had one child, Connor. We poured everything we had into that boy, not just money, though there was plenty of that too, but time, attention, values, or so I thought. Patricia passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer, caught too late. She was 54. After she died, Connor was 26, already living in Seattle, already building what looked from the outside like a successful life. He worked in tech sales, made decent money, and called me every Sunday. For a while, things between us were good. Grief had a way of pulling us together. Then he met Madison. I want to be fair. When Connor first introduced us, I tried. I genuinely tried. Madison was 29, attractive, confident in the way that some people are confident when they haven't yet been tested by anything serious. She worked as a brand consultant, which as far as I could tell meant she managed social media accounts for small businesses and occasionally posted photographs of herself in expensive restaurants with captions about authenticity and living intentionally. Our first dinner together, she talked for 40 minutes about her personal brand. She asked me 0 questions about myself. When Connor excused himself to use the restroom, she looked at me and said, "Connor says you're pretty well off. That must be nice at your age. Not having to worry." I should have said something then. I didn't. Within a year, they were engaged. Within 18 months, married. Within 2 years, Connor had quit his job, a good job, a stable job that he'd held for 4 years because Madison had convinced him that they should start a lifestyle content business together. They were going to document their life online. Their beautiful, curated, aspirational life. The problem was, their beautiful, curated life cost a great deal of money to maintain. And Connor, without a salary, and Madison, whose brand consulting had quietly dwindled to almost nothing, didn't have it. That's when the calls changed. The Sunday calls stopped being about how he was doing and started being about what he needed. First, it was a loan, $12,000 to cover a business investment that turned out to be a course on how to grow a YouTube channel. Then, it was a car payment. Then, it was to cover 3 months of rent on the apartment they'd leased in Austin because Madison decided Seattle's aesthetic wasn't right for their content. Then it was dental work that their lapsed insurance didn't cover. Then it was a camera package, a lighting package, a trip to Iceland because, as Connor explained it to me with complete sincerity, their audience expected a certain level of content. I gave. Every time. I gave. I told myself I was helping my son build something. I told myself Patricia would have done the same. I told myself this was temporary, that they were finding their footing. Over 4 years, I gave Connor and Madison just over $210,000. I never asked to be paid back. I never made it a condition. I gave because he was my son, And because somewhere in me, I still believed that the boy I had raised was still in there, and that one day he would look back at this time and understand the depth of what I had done for him. Instead, what happened was this. About a year ago, Connor called me, not on Sunday, on a Thursday afternoon, and said that he and Madison had found a house. A beautiful house, he said. 4 bedrooms, a pool, a dedicated studio space for filming, in a suburb outside of Nashville. The asking price was $680,000. He didn't have a down payment. He asked me if I would sell my house, the house I had built in 1997, the house where Connor grew up, the house where Patricia died in the guest room because she'd wanted to come home and use the equity to buy them this house outright. He said they would let me live in it with them. He used the word let. He said it would be good for all of us. He said I was getting older and shouldn't be managing a big house alone. He was not wrong that the house was too big for me alone. He was not wrong that I was getting older. What he was wrong about was everything else. I should have said no right then. I should have said no and meant it and held it. But I didn't. I compromised. I told him I would not sell my house, but I would help them with a down payment $100,000, which would be the last significant sum I would ever give them. I told him that clearly. I said, "This is the last time." He agreed. Madison, on the speakerphone that I hadn't known she was listening on, said, "Thank you, Harold. We really appreciate your support." She said support the way people say it when they mean investment. I wired the money. They bought the house, and for about 6 months, things were almost pleasant. Connor sent photos. They hosted Thanksgiving that year, and I flew to Nashville and slept in the guest room of a house that my money had helped purchase. Madison made a roasted turkey that was, I'll admit, quite good, and she hugged me at the door and called me Dad for the first time, and I genuinely thought we had turned a corner. I was wrong. What I didn't know at the time, and what I would only learn later, was that in the months before they asked me for that down payment, Madison had accumulated a significant amount of debt that had nothing to do with their content business. She had leased a Range Rover in her name, a loan $58,000, and within 7 months had rear-ended a parked delivery truck badly enough that the vehicle was totaled. She filed an insurance claim stating the vehicle had been stolen. The insurance company investigated. The claim was denied. She was now the subject of an ongoing insurance fraud inquiry. She also owed $32,000 to a production company in Los Angeles that she had hired, contracted, and then simply stopped paying when she decided their work wasn't good enough. They had since filed suit. There was also, though I did not know this yet, a prior eviction on her record from an apartment in Portland 3 years before she met Connor. An eviction that had been quietly settled out of court but was not entirely gone. None of this, I want to be clear, had anything to do with my son's character originally. My son was not a dishonest person, but he was a weak one, and he had handed Madison the wheel of his life, and she drove it the way she drove that Range Rover, fast, careless, and into things that didn't move. I learned all of this gradually, in pieces, the way you learn most devastating things. Not in a single conversation, but in a slow accumulation of small moments that don't make sense until they suddenly all make terrible sense at once. The corner we had turned at Thanksgiving turned out to lead to a dead end. In February, 8 months after I gave them the down payment, Connor called me again. Not on a Sunday, on a Tuesday, early in the morning when I was still having breakfast. He said they were in trouble. He said the content business had not grown the way they'd projected. He said they'd taken on some sponsorship deals that had fallen through. He said Madison had some legal expenses that were becoming a problem. He said the mortgage was difficult. He said he needed me to help cover 6 months of mortgage payments, their legal fees, and what he called operational costs for the business. I asked him to send me the numbers. He sent me a spreadsheet. The total, across all categories, itemized carefully in a font I recognized as the same one Madison used on their social media graphics, came to $245,000. I looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. Then I called him back. I said, "Connor, I told you last time was the last time." He said he understood that, but circumstances had changed. I said, "What changed?" There was a pause, and then Madison's voice came on the line. She had been there the whole time. "Of course," she said. "Harold, We're not asking you to be generous. We're asking you to be responsible. You raised Connor to expect a certain quality of life. You set those expectations. The least you can do is help maintain them. I said, I raised Connor to work hard and live within his means. She said, with respect, that's not how Connor experienced it. I told them I needed to think. I told them I would call back in a few days. I did not call back in a few days. What I did instead was call my attorney. And then I called a private investigator, a man named Gerald, who had done some work for my company years ago, and who was very good at finding things that people preferred stay unfound. Gerald did his work. It took him 3 weeks. What he brought me was a document 41 pages that contained, among other things, the full record of the insurance fraud inquiry, the civil suit from the Los Angeles production company, the prior eviction, documentation of a pattern of financial misrepresentation across 4 states over the past 6 years, and this one, I had not expected evidence that the lifestyle content brand Madison and Connor had built had purchased the majority of its followers and engagement metrics, meaning the audience they were selling to sponsors was largely fabricated. 41 pages. I read every one. I was sitting in this information, trying to decide how to proceed, when Connor called me again. 3 weeks had passed since our last conversation. This time he did not ask. He told me. He said that he and Madison had discussed it, and they had decided that if I was not willing to contribute to the family's financial stability, then it was not healthy for me to continue to be part of the household. He said, and I remember the precise words, "We need to be surrounded by people who support our vision, Dad, not people who hold us back with their limitations." I said, "I'm not part of your household, Connor. I live in my own home." He said, "Actually, that's something we need to talk about." And then he told me that he and Madison had consulted with a real estate attorney, and that under the terms of the estate planning documents I had signed when Patricia died, documents that named Connor as executor, he believed he had grounds to initiate a process to have my home reclassified as part of the estate's assets and placed under his management on account of my, and this is the word he used, diminished capacity to make sound financial decisions. I am 63 years old. I have never been diagnosed with anything. I manage my own finances, my own health, my own home. I maintain my own vehicle. I do the crossword puzzle every morning. I am, to put it plainly, completely fine. He was not alleging diminished capacity because he believed it. He was alleging it as a lever. There was a long silence on the line. Then I said, very calmly, "Connor, I love you. I have always loved you. But I want you to understand that you have just made a very serious mistake." He said, "Is that a threat, Dad?" I said, "It's a description of reality." I hung up and called my attorney immediately. My attorney, a very competent woman named Diane, reviewed the estate documents within 48 hours and confirmed that Connor's read of them was, at best, creative, and at worst, legally frivolous. The diminished capacity avenue would go nowhere. But she cautioned me the process of fighting it, even winning easily, could be expensive, slow, and public in ways I might not want. I told her I had some ideas about how to handle this. I think she could tell from my voice that I had already decided on something. She said, "Harold, whatever you're planning, just make sure I know about it first." I told her I would. Over the next 6 weeks, I did several things in a very specific order. First, I updated my estate documents completely. Connor was removed as executor and beneficiary. A charitable trust was designated as the primary beneficiary, with a small fund set aside for Connor contingent on conditions I will explain shortly. Diane filed everything properly. Second, I sent Connor a certified letter, not an email, not a text, a letter on paper with a return receipt formally declining to provide the $245,000, citing my clearly stated prior condition that my last gift was the last gift, and noting that any further attempts to access my assets through legal processes would be met with a full legal response, including countersuits for harassment and elder financial abuse. I had Diane draft that letter. It was very precise. Third, I reached out to the production company in Los Angeles that Madison had stiffed. Their attorney was still active on the case. I introduced myself, explained that I had documentation that might be useful to them, and offered to share it. They were, as you can imagine, quite interested. Fourth, I contacted the insurance company conducting the fraud inquiry regarding the Range Rover. I sent them a copy of Gerald's 41 pages, specifically the sections relevant to their investigation. I did this not out of cruelty, but because insurance fraud is a crime that costs all of us, and I am not in the business of protecting people from the consequences of crimes simply because they married my son. Fifth, and this is the one that took me the longest to decide, I reached out to 3 of the major brands that were currently in active sponsorship negotiations with Connor and Madison's content channel. I sent each of them a brief, factual, professionally worded letter, noting that I had documentation indicating that the channel's audience metrics had been artificially inflated through purchased followers and engagement, and that they may wish to conduct their own due diligence before finalizing any agreements. I included a summary of Gerald's findings. I did not editorialize. I simply provided facts. Diane reviewed all of this before I sent any of it. She raised an eyebrow at the sponsor letters. I told her I was simply sharing accurate information. She said, "That's technically true." She paused. Then, she said, "Harold, you're a more patient man than I am." I told her patience wasn't the right word. I told her the right word was methodical. I should tell you about the house. The Nashville house, the one my 100,000 helped buy, had a mortgage. Connor and Madison had taken it on together. My name was on nothing. I had given a gift, not a loan, and I had no claim on the property. I want to be clear about that because I don't want you to think what followed was about the money. It wasn't about recovering what I'd given. That money was gone and I had made my peace with that. What happened with the house happened on its own, driven by forces I had set in motion but did not directly control. The sponsor negotiations collapsed within 2 weeks of my letters. 3 brands pulled out. The content business, which had been running on the fumes of projected sponsorship income, lost its projected revenue for the next 2 quarters overnight. The production company lawsuit, strengthened by my documentation, accelerated to a judgment that had to be paid. The insurance fraud inquiry expanded. Madison hired a lawyer. That cost money. The mortgage, which had already been difficult by Connor's own admission, became impossible. They listed the house 4 months after Connor had sent me that bill. They sold it at a loss. After the mortgage payoff and the real estate fees, they walked away with almost nothing. I heard all of this not from Connor, but from my cousin Ruth, who lives in Nashville and had, over the course of that year, become a quiet and reliable source of information. Ruth is 71 and she has never liked people who take advantage of others. She called me with updates the way some people share weather reports matter-of-factly, without drama. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon in October and she said, "Harold, they're moving out next week, into an apartment. Madison's attorney fees are apparently substantial." I said, "Thank you, Ruth." She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I think I am." Connor called me that same evening. It was the first time he had called me since the certified letter. It had been 4 months. When I saw his name on my phone, I sat down before I answered. I wanted to be sitting down. His voice was different. It was quieter. The certainty was gone. He said, "Dad." I said, "Connor." He didn't say anything for a moment. I waited. I have learned, in 63 years, that silence is not something to be afraid of. I let it sit between us. Finally, he said, "I know what you did." I said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it." Another pause. The sponsors, the insurance company, the production company lawsuit. I said, "I shared accurate information with parties who had a legitimate interest in it." He said, "You destroyed everything we built." I said, "Connor, what you and Madison built was a house of cards. I didn't destroy it. You built it to fall." He made a sound. I couldn't tell if it was anger or something else. Then he said, "She's leaving me." I hadn't expected that. I was quiet for a moment. He said, "Her attorney told her it was a liability issue. Being married to me, with my credit now, is apparently a liability issue for her." I said, very carefully, "I'm sorry to hear that. I know that's painful." He said, "Are you? Are you actually sorry?" I told him the truth. I said, "I'm sorry you're in pain. I'm not sorry that you're now dealing with reality. I think reality is the kindest thing that could have happened to you. He didn't say anything. I said, Connor, do you remember what your mother used to say? When you were maybe 12 or 13 and you came to her complaining about something being unfair? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, quietly, she said life doesn't owe you fair. It only owes you a chance. I said, yes, you still have a chance. You're 34 years old. You have a working brain and your father's stubbornness, which is worth more than you know. But you have to start from honest ground. You can't start from a story. You have to start from what's actually true. He said, how do I do that? And here's the thing about raising a child. Here's the thing that you carry with you no matter what they do to you. You do not stop being their father. The love doesn't switch off because they betrayed you. It just lives differently. It becomes quieter and more serious and less willing to be taken advantage of, but it doesn't leave. I said, you start by getting a job, a real job, with a salary and responsibilities and a boss who holds you accountable. You live in an apartment you can actually afford. You don't spend money, you don't have to create an image you haven't earned. And you call me every Sunday the way you used to. And we talk, not about what you need, about how you are. That's how you start. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, I was terrible to you, Dad. I said, yes, you were. He said, I don't think I knew how bad it was while it was happening. I think I let myself believe things that weren't true because it was easier than admitting how lost I was. I said, I know. He said, did you know when you changed the estate documents? I said, I changed the documents to protect myself from a legal threat you initiated, but I want you to know something. There is a contingency in those documents. If, in 5 years, you can demonstrate through documentation that Diane will review that you are living responsibly, that you have cleared your debts through your own work, and that you have maintained a genuine relationship with me, then a portion of what was originally designated to you will be restored. Not because you earned it as an inheritance, because you'll have earned it as a person. He was quiet again. He said, 5 years. I said, 5 years. He said, okay. We talked for another 20 minutes that night. He told me about the apartment he was looking at. He told me he'd reached out to an old colleague about a job opening in sales operations. He sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard from him in years, tired the way people are tired when they've stopped performing and started actually living. Before we hung up, he said, Dad, the note I put with that bill, the thing I said about your contribution. I said, yes. He said, I'm sorry. I'm ashamed of that. I said, I know. He said, I need to tell you something. That note was Madison's idea. The wording. I copied it almost exactly from something she sent to her own parents 3 years ago. I didn't even question it. I went along with it. I thought about that. I thought about a boy who learned to read in a living room that would always be his home no matter what, who watched football with his father on Sunday afternoons, who held his mother's hand in the last weeks of her life, and cried in a way that told me he understood what it was to love something completely and lose it. I said, Connor, come home for Christmas. He said, yeah? I said, yeah. I put down the phone, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time without moving. Outside, it was getting dark. The yard needed work. I'd let it go a little in the fall, and the flower beds along the back fence had grown over. Patricia's flower beds. She'd planted them the spring after Connor was born and kept them every year until she couldn't. I decided I would work on them that weekend, clear them out, put them to bed properly before the winter came. Maybe in the spring, replant some things. That is the thing about honest ground. You can plant things there. You can plant things there, and they have a real chance to grow. I want to tell you one more thing. A few weeks after that phone call with Connor, I received a letter from Madison's attorney. It was a brief, formal, carefully neutral document. It acknowledged that in the course of their divorce proceedings, it had come to light that Madison had made certain financial representations to Connor that were not accurate, and that some funds which had been jointly managed had been used for personal purposes without Connor's knowledge. The letter did not contain an apology. It was not designed to, but embedded in its careful legal language was something that functioned as one. I showed it to Diane. She read it and said, Then she said, "Do you want to do anything with this?" I said, "No." She said, "You sure?" I said, "She's someone else's problem now." Diane laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that means something. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, and I have not thought about it much since. What I do think about is this. There is a version of the last 4 years in which I kept giving, in which I gave the $245,000, and then whatever came after that, and whatever came after that, in which I told myself, each time, that this was love, that this was what a good father does. That version of me would have run out of money eventually, or he would have run out of himself, which is worse. The version of me that said no, that hired Gerald, that sent certified letters and made phone calls and sat in silence and waited, that version of me still has his house, still has his yard with Patricia's flower beds, still has a son who is coming home for Christmas, still has himself. My name is Harold. I am 63 years old. I built bridges for a living, and I will tell you what every engineer knows. The most important part of any structure is what you leave out. The joints that have room to flex. The load-bearing elements that hold only what they are designed to hold. The foundation that is honest about what the ground beneath it actually is. I did not give my son everything he asked for. I gave him something better. I gave him the ground. What he builds on it is up to him now.